Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks to Giovanna for having me here today. I'm very glad to be back at CESTA. And what I'll present today are the results of a project that I started during my time here at CESTA. I had started working with early modern law dissertations during my PhD. That was mostly in close reading. To me, they were invaluable sources for the legal history of the German lands, and specifically questions around freedom of movement. But there is a lot of them. So this is my attempt at approaching these documents in a more comprehensive way through distant reading. The work that I'm presenting today has been published recently in two articles, one in the Historical Journal and the other in a journal called Current Research in Digital History. If you would like to see a more detailed discussion of the things I'm presenting today, you can have a look. You can have a look at those. Right. Let me get started. Disputations were one of the most common teaching formats in European universities from the High Middle Ages to the end of the 18th century. Students and faculty regularly held disputations to practice defending arguments, to prove their mastery of a subject, or to obtain academic degrees. Usually, these exercises involved a respondent who, under the direction of a professor or a lecturer, the praeses, had to defend publicly a number of theses against the objections brought forward by an opponent. Now, this was a largely oral exercise, but from the end of the 16th century, disputations were increasingly accompanied by printed Latin texts. Initially, these were simple summaries of the key theses put forward, but in the course of the 17th century, these printed dissertations grew longer, so they could range from tens to hundreds of pages. Now, the tens of thousands of dissertations that were written at German universities have long had a difficult standing among historians. They were often disdained for their poor quality. They were poorly catalogued. In part, they still remain poorly catalogued, and they make for awkward reading, written in an awkward Latin, full of imprecise quotes, set in different font sizes and types. But in recent decades, scholars have increasingly rediscovered these abundant but elusive sources and recognized them as the key medium through which 17th century jurists communicated their scholarship before that function was taken over by journals and periodic literature. Now, the main obstacle to engaging, and there's a rich scholarship of historians who work with these dissertations in close reading. The main obstacle of engaging with the entire corpus has always been the dissertation's sheer number. There have been some important studies, notably pioneering work by Filippo Ranieri and by Karl Herter, but these remained limited to specific subsets, for instance, public law dissertations. Now, for this project, I analyzed the metadata of over 20,000 legal dissertations in BD 17, which is a bibliography of prints from German-speaking Europe in the 17th century. This is a catalog that is far from complete. Many dissertations remain uncatalogued or were lost. But it is the most complete data set that we have on these dissertations. Now, the main challenge in working with this data is a very high number of duplicates. So I counted around 3,700 and reprints, around 600, that I had to mark and filter in this data set, partly automatically with OpenRefine, but unfortunately also laboriously by hand. So a good amount of my lockdown was spent doing that work. And that left around 16,000 singular dissertations. Now, the subjects, and I'll come to that in a minute, the subjects treated in legal dissertations were remarkably diverse. Their geography was not. More than half of the legal dissertations of the 17th century were written at just a handful of Protestant universities: Jena, Wittenberg, Strasbourg, Altdorf, Leipzig, and Frankfurt on Oder. Now, in this overview chart, what's clearly visible is the impact of the 30 Years' War that led to a decline and sometimes even the closure of universities, with overrun enrollment going back by up to 50% of pre-war levels. The large burst of dissertations in the 1660s was largely fueled by the universities of Frankfurt Oder and Jena, where scholars like Samuel Strück and Ernst Friedrich Schröter attracted large numbers of students. Overall, however, the dissertations were distributed more equally in the second half of the century. And that is in line with what we know about German university, the German university landscape in those years, which saw a longer trend of decentralization between the 16th and the 17th century, where many imperial states founded their own universities, their own Landesuniversitäten. Particularly striking is the case of Halle, a key center of German pietism and Enlightenment thought, which jumped to prominence almost immediately after its founding. I could say a couple more things about this, but I want to move on and look a bit at the themes that are covered in these dissertations and what we can see about that. Now, civil law subjects form the largest cluster of dissertations in total. So around, at any given time, 35%, or over the century, around 35% of the catalog dissertations can be classed as civil law dissertations. So including fields like the law of obligations, family law, property law, or inheritance law. Now, what you can see in this chart for some of these fields is that the proportion of civil law dissertations fell by almost half in the course of the century. And what's interesting is that this decline can be observed across all principal domains of civil law in relative and in absolute terms, with few notable exceptions. And I'll talk about those in a minute. One example is inheritance law. So in the first quarter of the century, up to 10% of all dissertations discussed matters of inheritance law, but that proportion dropped by half by the end of the century. And the same trend is observable in property law. In the second half of the century, the proportion of dissertations that discussed key concepts of property law, so from servitude to possession, fell by more than half. Now, this is not entirely news. Declining interest in civil law has already been observed in smaller sets of evidence, but the data under consideration here suggests a decline of printed civil law scholarship catalogued in VD 17 that was much more comprehensive and starker than previously observed. Now, this was certainly connected to the emergence of public law and the attraction of employment opportunities in the growing princely administrations. It could even point to a problem of scholarly saturation, as some scholars have suggested, but a shift of this magnitude to me is a remarkable development. Many of the civil law institutions treated in these dissertations played a crucial role in early modern economic life and in the history of capitalism. They were the key frameworks for negotiating the ownership of the means of production, for organizing the decentralized production and distribution of goods, for mediating intergenerational wealth distribution, or for investing capital. The dissertations suggest that large numbers of German learned elites lost interest in the laws that regulated these fundamental mechanisms of economic life. An observation that I cannot say a lot more about, but that I believe deserves more scrutiny. And while the dissertation titles cannot explain this shift, I think they do raise questions that deserve further study. Now, what's interesting is, if you look at this chart, is that two civil law subjects alluded to this pattern. One is dissertations mentioning creditores, debitores, usury, interest, and debt default, mora, which peaked during the 30 Years' War and its aftermath. And this could very likely be connected to the debt crisis faced by the lower nobility and many free and imperial cities in the aftermath of the war, attracting legal interest even when jurists lost interest in all other forms of obligation. And the other is marriage, which saw a rising interest in the last third of the century, probably an early sign of the Enlightenment discussions around the reordering of familiar relations that foreshadowed later reforms. Legal interest in money and questions related to mint peaked visibly during the monetary crisis of the 1620s, Kipper and Wipper, and the 1670s and 1680s. Many of the dissertations published in those years devote particular attention to the imperial estate's minting rights and the debasement of coinage. So that much about some of the topics and that are covered in these dissertations, how this kind of approach can help us get a sense how these developed in the long term. Now let me turn to the language that is used in these titles, that is used to frame these dissertations. In the first half of the 17th century, the language of the dissertation titles, a genre, as I mentioned earlier, closely related to the oral disputation, increasingly lost its dialogic attributes. And this is particularly visible in the decline of the quaestio. Questiones were one of the most frequent literary forms in medieval universities and the guiding literary genre of scholasticism. A key characteristic of the quaestio was to frame statements as true or false, requiring a reasoned decision for one of two sides. In the 17th century, the use of questions and disputations became contentious, as many tended to regard the strict question and answer format as antiquated. Another emblematic indicator for the dissertations polyphony was controversia with its adjectival variations. In the rhetorical tradition, controversia was a matter of dispute or a legal case that played an important didactic role. The subjects of controversia were commonly formulated as questions that a student was to decide by using various legal sources and scholarship. Now, questiones and controversia were very common in dissertation titles during the first third of the century, but jurists used these words much less frequently from the 1640s onward. The sustained decline of quaestio and controversia in the course of the century underscores a development that other scholars have conjectured with quoting much caution, but struggle to substantiate simply because of the lack of quantitative evidence. So this confirms a turn from a polyphonic disputation to the genre transforming into a respondent's monologue. Now, this declining stature of dialogue and controversy reflected broader changes in German academic culture towards the end of the 17th century. Oral disputations increasingly lost their adversarial character and became a gallant act of conversation. So, for instance, disputants would avoid direct contradiction. They wouldn't use words like nego hoc or absurdum est, and rather use meeker and milder terms. The fact that the attributes of the oral adversarial disputation dissipated gradually, so over the course of the entire century, rather than just in the space of a few years, indicates that this was a long-term structural evolution rather than a short-lived phenomenon. Now, the overall declining appeal of dialogue and controversy had effects on the way that jurists defined the subjects of their dissertations. The dialogic dissertations mostly focused on questions that were established enough to spark controversy. Approaching a subject through questiones and controversia made sense where there was scholarly disagreement that could be articulated in arguments and counterarguments. While the more single-voice dissertations that we find in the latter part of the century also weighed conflicting points of view, in this model, controversy was an option rather than the defining framework. As many dissertations lost their antagonistic layout, their authors became keener on exploring subjects that were original rather than controversial. And this simultaneously broadened and sharpened thematic scope is the subject of the next charts that I'm going to show you. Now, dissertations compiled of questiones, of controversia, positiones, theses, themata, often drew their subject from different fields, different subjects, and different law sources. And the titles did not hide the text's assorted nature. Numerals specified the number of theses, positions, questions, and controversies addressed. The more, the better. Dissertations contained decades due controversiarum, politicarum propositionum decas una, or decas questionum juridicarum. The plurality of questions covered in the dissertations was also expressed in with the attribute miscellaneous. The most telling indicator, however, is perhaps the little adverb ex, which connected the assemblage of theses to broader subject matters, as in this example, decuria controversarum questionum ex usufructus materia dissertarum, to the classic texts of Roman law, so disputatio ex libri desumpta, and to different fields of jurisprudence, as in this case, questionum controversarum ex jure civili canonico et feudali de promptarum. Framing a study as part of an established theme, source, or field of the law The little word X indicates a key pattern of thought in the 16th and early 17th century dissertations. Legal scholarship was about revealing the truth contained in established text rather than opening new fields of empirical inquiry. Now, all these features declined substantially in the course of the century as large shares of the dissertations developed from motley assemblages into thematically focused and monographic treatises. The authors did not feel the need to highlight the variety of questions or to situate the titles within broader fields of knowledge. Disputatio inauguralis de ignorantia did not need to justify its interest with reference to Justinian, to the Pandects, or established taxonomies of knowledge. Introduced with a simple ablative and the monosyllabic de, the subject stood for itself. Now, the dissertation's heightened thematic focus also facilitated the use of German language in the titles. And to be clear here, Latin remained the dominant academic language in German universities well into the 19th century. Of the hundreds of thousands of early modern dissertations, less than 50 were written in German. But monographic dissertations that treated clearly circumscribed subjects, many of them connected to the author's life world or customary law, made it plausible to use double titles, as in this example, Discursus Juridicus de Clamore Violentia, vulgo Zettergeschrei, where the subject of the dissertation, in this case, loud scolding, was given both in Latin and in German, often specified by words like vulgo or Germanice. Now, while the hegemony of Latin language came under increasing pressure in the second half of the 18th century, the dissertation titles in BD 17 show that the acceptance of German and academic jurisprudence increased visibly in the last third of the century. The titles were given in German when there was an established Latin vocabulary sparked controversy in an academic community that jealously guarded its linguistic walls. Critics feared that the use of German language, would lead jurists to neglect succinct definitions, subtle conceptual distinctions, and secular traditions of scholarship. And I'll come back to German towards the end of the talk. Now, the decline of quaestio and controversia and the increasing thematic compactness of these texts went hand in hand with a gradual easing of the logical and rhetorical constraint placed on dissertations. Arguments from authority and strict schemes like the genera causarum lost in importance, and scholars were encouraged to think more independently and write more freely. A key characteristic of this development was that jurists attempted to systematize a wide range of norms and observations around a single theme or question. And this could be a fairly straightforward exercise. So think of dissertations on fields like neighborly relations. But it required more creativity and imagination in other cases, as in a dissertation on anger, dissertations on curiosity, or dissertations on people who meddle in other people's affairs, the dissertation on meddlers. And to be clear, the majority of dissertations continue to treat very conventional subjects, so nothing like this. But the number of novel dissertation subjects increased markedly in the latter part of the 17th century, offering a new and unique perspective on how learned contemporaries understood the world they inhabited. And in their search for novelty, the authors frequently turned to seemingly mundane, peculiar and variegated elements of everyday life. Some jurists evinced a set of interests that 2 centuries later were taken up by cultural and social anthropologists. In these cases, the dissertations became an original and innovative genre in which lawyers could survey a wide array of questions and systematize apparently unconnected phenomena under one heading. For example, a dissertation on the law of nudity offered a framework for linking discussions around bathhouses, sexuality, witchcraft, torture, headscarves, royal crowns, rape investigations, abortion, bare feet, and the problem of baldness. Overall, historians who are interested in the idiosyncrasies of these archives may find the monographic, more thematically varied, focused, and frequently original dissertations of the latter decades of the 17th century of greater interest than the more conventional, rigid, and collated disputations of earlier decades. The legal dissertations of the late 17th century offer an almost inexhaustible source of associative license from the past that few historians would dare to afford on their own. In my own work, in my recent study on the history of borders and freedom of movement in the Holy Roman Empire, for example, it was striking to observe how questions related to freedom of movement and its restriction were treated extensively in texts around the legal nature of roads and rivers, but not in the otherwise abundant legal dissertations on boundaries and borders. This indicated that for early modern jurists, borders and boundaries were not yet a shorthand for state interferences with human mobility, as they would be in later centuries. And that is just one example for how that became intellectually productive in my own research. Another recipe for originality was to embrace metaphor. Metaphorical connections could let the dissertation subject explode, as in the case of a 1681 dissertation on shadows. The range of issues covered by the authors in this text includes the physics of light, building law, the representation of shade in the pictorial arts, ghosts, curtains, people's fear of the dark, and the placement of gibbets on territorial borders, so that the shadow does not fall on the neighboring land. The shadow as a metaphor, however, allowed the authors even to include subjects like slander, throwing shade, or how to deal with unwanted visitors who tend to follow invited guests like a shadow. Right. Now, one of the limitations of the charts that I've presented and discussed so far is that they aggregate the data in ways that make it difficult to identify the role played by different groups of authors. Change appears as the effect of an abstract, anonymous, and non-aged zeitgeist, rather than as the product of specific groups or individuals. So to visualize the relationship between age cohorts and word frequencies, as I'm going to show now, what I did is I combined demographic data, which was included in the metadata. So for every precis, we had a birth date, and word frequencies in a technique that was first proposed by Benjamin Schmidt at NYU. Now, these Lexis diagrams visualize the number of dissertations in black dots. So this is the size of the dots that you can see here, with the years of publications on the horizontal axis, and the age of the age of the precis on the vertical axis. And then we have this smooth color palette from a light yellow to a dark green that indicates the proportion of dissertations whose titles contain specific keywords. And the dot's variable size helps to understand whether keyword frequencies are found in many or in few dissertations. And essentially, you can make out two patterns in these kinds of charts. Changes that cut across age cohorts follow a vertical pattern, as you can see here. So in this case, scholars of all age cohorts began publishing significantly fewer dissertations that were framed as controversia within the range of a few years, and almost stopped altogether in around 1640. It's not a perfectly vertical line, but it is certainly moving more vertically than diagonal. Now, in contrast, more diagonal patterns indicate vocabulary use that was specific to particular age cohorts. So at a specific point in time, in this example, younger and middle-aged scholars intensified their use of German vocabulary in the titles. And again, it's not a perfect trend, but it is moving more by age cohort than by year. It's more a diagonal pattern rather than a vertical pattern. Now, there's one thing that I should say about early modern dissertations. They have one characteristic that deserves further discussion here, and that is that the vast majority of early modern dissertations features two authors, a presiding professor, so the precis, his name you can see here, so precis, in this case, Heinrich Kästner, and the responding students, the respondents. So here, abbreviated as respondents, in this case, a certain Johannes Kranz. If both the presidents and the respondents had contributed to the text in equal shares, or if the dissertations had been authored exclusively by the respondents, then the approach that I'm adopting here would be of very limited value. However, in practice, early modern dissertations were often written by the presidents themselves. So for professors and lecturers, dissertations offered an opportunity to publish their work until that function was later taken over by journals. And even in cases, at least when it comes to law dissertations, even in cases where appraisers did not write a text themselves, it can be assumed that they had a strong influence on and a stake in its subject and content. So that's an important premise to do here. What I should also say is that the charts that I'm going to show are based on a smaller sample. So I excluded all entries without birth dates and those that only listed a praeses but no respondent from the study, which leaves roughly 11,600 dissertations. Now, age and publication averages for the praeses provide important baselines for understanding the demography of this genre. In the 17th century, the average age of a law dissertation supervisor, a praeses, in German universities was 41 years. That increased from 39 to 44 in the course of the century, with a surge during the 30 Years' War, when the average age of a praeses increased sharply and never returned to the pre-war levels. The majority of dissertations were supervised by praeses in their late 20s, 30s, and 40s. Very young praeses were not usually professors, but scholars who had recently earned their doctorate and were allowed to exceptionally preside over dissertation, for example, to further their careers. And from the age of 45 and upwards, the number of praeses decreased steadily, although some scholars continued to preside over dissertations well into old age. Now, we already saw that the proportion of law dissertations that included German words in their titles increased from the 1660s onwards. But this breakdown by age shows that this new preference was not shared by all members of the profession. The initial increase of German vernacular titles in the 1660s was primarily driven by younger and middle-aged scholars, that is, praeses in their 30s and 40s. Older scholars never took up the new tract to the same degree as their younger colleagues. In contrast, rather than, and I think what this tells us is that rather than being the merit of one or a few eminent individuals, the gradual rise of the German vernacular in the late 17th century titles appears to reflect a shift in preference that was shared across large numbers of scholars with a common historical. Oh, sorry, I actually missed I missed a little important bit here, so let me just say that. Exactly. So in contrast, cohorts of scholars who entered the profession during or after the 1660s used the German vernacular in their dissertation titles with more regularity. And again, the distribution is not perfectly diagonal. The increase of German titles, however, is moving more by generation than it is moving by year. And I think we can take two interesting insights from this. The first is that existing scholarship on dissertations is centered primarily on discussions around language use in theological and philosophical dissertations, and has suggested two principal reasons for which scholars prefer German. One, an enlightened desire to reach a broader non-academic public, including women, and discontent about the disputants' poor Latin, which arguably resulted in students devoting more energy or praeses more energy to the form of their writing than to its content. Now, the graphic suggests that among jurists, the preference for the German vernacular was also a matter of demographics. The early increase of bilingual dissertation titles was primarily driven by scholars in their 30s and 40s. And these cohorts of scholars were born in the 1620s and 1630s and experienced the 30 Years' War as students in schools and universities, only entering the profession once the war was over. Now, this will be no news to linguists who will tell us that age cohorts shared or differential experience of war, economic crisis, or social transformation has regularly been identified as a key driver of linguistic change. The second insight that I think we can take from this is that the graphic invites us to reassess the importance of individual initiative in such shifts. So it has been common to credit individual scholars with advancing the use of the German vernacular and other important shifts in this literature. But I think what we're seeing here is that rather than being the merit of one or a few eminent individuals, the gradual rise of the German vernacular appears to reflect a shift in preference that was shared across large numbers of scholars with a common historical experience. Right, let me discuss a different pattern. In contrast, the decline in dissertation titles that featured scholastic keywords, and the scholastic keyword controversial in this case, indicates a turn away from dialogic and antagonistic forms of argumentation across all age cohorts, and points to a cultural shift that was more widespread and swifter than others. Now, the sharp drop in dissertations framed as controversial in the 1610s, and their all but disappearance in the late 1630s, again, although slightly uneven, was not restricted to a particular age cohort, but was shared by jurists across all ages. This was something that all age cohorts changed their minds about within a short amount of time. And I don't have an explanation for the all but disappearance of controversia for the legal dissertation titles, but I shared this work with one of the foremost experts of early modern dissertations, Hans-Peter Marti, a scholar in Switzerland, who helped me to formulate a hypothesis. I'm going to share that here, but it is a hypothesis. Now, it's that in early modern book titles, controversia did not just designate a rhetorical form. The word had featured prominently in the publication titles of polemical theologians since the days of Johannes Kochleus and came to connote a particularly polemical and intransigent form of scholarship. Now, this decline happens at the same time in which Protestant universities instituted the first dedicated chairs for controversial theology and incorporated the subject into academic curricula. And the meaning of controversia in those years further narrowed to denote inter- and intra-confessional polemics. So the simultaneous all but disappearance of controversia from the titles of legal dissertations at the same time as the word acquired a distinctively confessional connotation may well indicate a shared desire to avoid association with religious polemics in a collective move that one could call methodological Irenicism. Now again, this is very much a hypothesis. All right, let me show you one last example, and then I'll conclude. And that is territorium and territorialis. Now, for anyone who is familiar with the history of the Holy Roman Empire in the 17th century, the notion of territorial superiority, Landeshoheit, Landesobrigkeit, played a key role in the legal political conflicts of the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 17th century, the prince's power was increasingly understood not as emanating from their jurisdiction or as a bundle of diverse regalian rights and prerogatives, so anything from safe conduct to mining, but as the comprehensive dominion over a territory. And the Peace of Westphalia codified the concept as jus territorii et superioritatis. And that's why I think the pattern visible here is noteworthy for three reasons. First, while some dissertations on territorial superiority had been published in the first half of the century, this shows that the territory only began to appear regularly in dissertation titles from the 1660s onward. Now, of course, questions concerning territorial rights had long been discussed in dissertations that did not mention the word in their title. However, territory's late appearance in the dissertation titles is surprising, given the importance of territory in 17th century legal discourse. The second thing I find interesting is that the graphic shows that the later appearance of territory in the dissertation titles was a distinctly generational phenomenon. Dissertation titles mentioning territory were published with regularity from the 1660s onwards, but almost exclusively by praeseders in their 20s and 30s. It was not until later that territorium and territorialis appeared more consistently in the dissertation titles of other age cohorts. Now, that territory was reintroduced into dissertation titles mostly by a young cohort of scholars over a decade after the 30 Years' War indicates that one of the most consequential legal political concepts of the mid-17th century may have faced more academic inertia than the emphasis on territorial superiority and its cognate concepts would suggest. And third, and last, and then I'll conclude, is the prominent placement of territory in the titles of dissertations by younger scholars adds to a pragmatic theory about why jurists chose the subjects on which they worked. The German historian Karl Herthe argued that jurists preferred topical subjects that appealed to imperial or territorial authorities to improve their career prospects or transition into administrative role, a bit like the Stanford undergraduates who are all studying computer science. The chart suggests that age may have played a key role in a choice that made particular sense early in a jurist's career. Indeed, for most young presidents who placed the language of territory so prominently in their dissertation in the 60s and 70s, they later took on important positions in territorial administrations. And the wider implication there might be that younger jurists may have played a particularly important role as intellectual conduits between academic jurisprudence and policy, and that when studying processes of reception between the territorial administrations and legal scholarship, it may be worth to pay particular attention to the works of younger scholars. So I guess, again, a somewhat conjectural, but perhaps somewhat broader conclusion here. All right, let me let me conclude. So what I hope is that this distant reading of 17th century law dissertations could highlight some of the shifting interests and methods of the anonymous mass of jurists that populated universities, courts, chanceries, and offices across the Holy Roman Empire. And you'll see that technically this was very straightforward. All I did here was use relative word frequency counts. And I also would like to say that even in cases where the visualization alone was not sufficient to explain a distinctive pattern, so think, for example, of the case of controversia, the approach presented here nuances, assumptions, and hypotheses that were formed through close reading and evinces patterns that traditional research has been unable to document, offering a more detailed case of the explanandum, and which is, that's why I'm saying this, an important way, I think, in which computational methods can contribute to argumentation and interpretation in historical research. Now, I should also say that my work with these sources has probably raised more questions than it could answer. There's a lot of work left to do with dissertations, with the metadata of the dissertations, including dissertations, and I only looked at law dissertations, but there are large numbers of dissertations in philosophy, theology, and medicine. I know that there are colleagues in Germany. There's a colleague, Stefan Hesburg-Walter, who is working on the philosophical dissertations. But obviously, there are also dissertations in other regions, but also dissertations in other time periods. And sooner or later, we will dispose of full texts for these dissertations, and that might change things entirely and allow to study the language of early modern dissertations in much more detail. So. Essentially, what I hope is that this is only a first, an early foray into a field where I hope we'll see a lot more exciting work